we don't have to dive right in right this second. But like, I always like, I like to keep it rolling, and we're gonna edit this. It's obviously not live or anything like that. So, oops, we lost Diet for a second. When we'll give you an opportunity to kind of like see the draft, and if there's anything you're like, ooh, let's take that part out or something like that. We're happy to do that. Everyone's got to. This isn't anyone's day job, so we don't want to cause reputational issues for anyone or employment issues. I'm a big proponent of direct deposit.
Yep.
Something I've never asked you. I always call you Dr. Nancy, but do you go by Dr. Dome? What do you prefer?
Nancy is great, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I would prefer. I put doctor there because I know it's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my field, but I would prefer just to have my name. But what I recognize the more and more I do this work is the level of disrespect that people have not willing to acknowledge my title and my effort, and so it just becomes something that now it's just automatic. I actually thought about it before putting it on because I feel very comfortable with all of you, and even though I've only been to a couple of the mixed spaces, I really enjoyed that. But other people will see it, and it's just something about folks needing to understand, and have a level of respect for the effort that it takes to get those initials.
That's interesting that you say that. If you don't mind drilling down on that a little bit, like what type of disrespect have you experienced?
Well, actually, like some students refusing to even use my name, right? I mean,
Wow.
to use my title, and I'm a professor. So everyone that's teaching them is Dr. someone, and students saying Miss, and especially if you call me my first name, I'm usually not going to know because that's what I prefer. But I actually had students just say, Miss Dome, and I'm like, it's not Miss Dome, it's Doctor, and really needing to just let them know, and also people I work with who also default to Miss Dome, even though I have Doctor. And for me, because I always am very insistent about, use my first name. I like it to be informal. When someone goes out of their way to put a Miss in front instead of the Doctor, it also is giving me signals.
Yeah, that is interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, I had not, not really spoken with anyone, who was credentialed, like you about sort of, what some of those struggles might look like. So that's really interesting. Hi there, Sana. Sana, can you hear us?
I think she's frozen.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, she looks frozen to me. That's pretty frozen.
At least she has a good expression on her face. Oh, there we go.
Oh, wait, there we are.
I'm going to step away for just 1 second.
No problem. Sana, can you hear us?
Yeah, I have a good Wi-Fi reception, but I don't know why this application, it's not great on this application. But on Zoom, it works really well, and on other applications. So I'm going to just try my best.
Okay.
Do you have any other tabs open? Sometimes if you have a bunch of browser tabs, that could do it.
I don't, just my email, which I can close. Yeah, this is the only tab open. I have the router in my room. Reception is strong. Nobody else is using the internet. So I don't know what's going on.
You look pretty good. So I think it might be okay. Oops. Sorry, get out of the stream.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you look pretty good. So I'm not sure. I think it might be fine.
Okay, hopefully it'll be okay.
Yeah, hang on a second. Let me see if I can.
Do you have a way to test the microphone?
Test the microphone. Let's see.
You sound good.
You sound great.
Okay.
Sound good to us.
Okay, cool. All right.
It's good to see you. It's been a little while since I've seen you.
Congrats. How's the baby?
Thank you. Yeah, she's fierce.
That's how you want your girl, I think.
Yep. Keep them fierce, like mama. Right. Well, is everybody ready? Anybody need a minute?
Do I need to change my name to add my last name?
Totally up to you. You can be, woman of mystery and just go by one name, like Cher, or I guess I'm dating myself there. I should say Madonna or
That's
I'll
dating.
that's dating myself too, right?
I'll just
Drake.
initial.
Drake. Let's go with that. Or Beyonce. You can just be Beyonce. Beyonce of our podcast. Although, she's been around so long, that's probably dating myself too. So I'm just old. I just have to, maybe I'll just embrace that.
I don't think Beyonce ever goes out of style.
No, she doesn't. I'm still old, but you're right. I think Beyonce is pretty timeless.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, super excited to kicking off our first podcast episode. And super excited to have Dr. Nancy Dome, have Sana here with us. Of course, I'm Chris G, and we're here with my co-hosts, Ayat and Karen. I don't know. Do we just want to kick off and jump right into it?
Let's do some introductions, and let's do introductions first.
Fantastic. Well, why don't you start first?
Me?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. Hi, I'm Karen Amundsen, co-host of Deeper Than Color podcast, and really excited to be here with our guests. My day job, I am founder and chair of Apiary Digital, a growth marketing collective. And as a white lady named Karen, I am really interested in diving into just being able to engage in these amazing conversations with really intelligent folks who have perspectives that I think we've been having these conversations for a long time. I'm just super excited to share broader.
Fantastic. Ayat, do you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Ayat Shakari, and very excited also to be with our guests today. Karen and I are both in the digital marketing world. I am the co-founder of Invest, a conversion rate optimization company. Again, been having these conversations for now the last couple of years, and I'm just excited that now we're bringing it into fruition a little bit more on a podcast. So excited to be here with the guests and to delve in a little bit deeper. I will be moderating this specific episode.
Fantastic. And I think I mentioned a second ago, I'm Chris G. I am head of digital for corporate and public affairs at Edelman PR, which is a large PR firm, the largest PR firm in the world. And super excited to be here. Podcasts are kind of a theme for me right now. I'm also producing a podcast about my family's history. Some cousins of mine and I traced our first ancestor that we can document back to 1786, and have some really interesting stories about her journey as well as her posterity and everything. So hey, once you kind of doing one podcast, like the hardest thing is to do one. After you're doing one, it's easy to kind of do 3 or 4. So I'm actually doing 3 or 4 as we speak. But really excited here, and I think it'd be also great to kind of like let's have our guests introduce themselves. Maybe Dr. Nancy and then Sana, you guys can introduce yourselves as well.
Great. My name is Nancy Dome, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Epic Education, which is a consultancy that works with primarily school districts, but also small businesses around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I was excited to be invited to be a part of this this first podcast. I enjoyed the mixed spaces groups that you had. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend enough, but I really enjoyed just the conversation and the diversity of thought and people there. So very excited to be a part of this today. Thanks for having me.
And if I can interject, Dr. Nancy Dome also has a book that is very relevant to this episode.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. It's called Let's Talk About Race and Other Hard Things. And so it is available on Amazon, and it's just looking at a protocol to have compassionate dialogue and why we need compassionate dialogue now.
Fantastic. And Sana?
Hi, I'm Sana. I am an English teacher. Currently, I'm teaching at the Athenian School, and I'm teaching African American literature. And I am very interested in all topics social justice. I have a social justice themed book club in my neighborhood. I've worked with activism in my community for most of my adult life. And I'm also really honored to be among all of you and to get into this topic.
All right, excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to kicking it off. I mean, again, like I said, I will be moderating this session, so I'm not going to be as active. But one thing I want to say is, of course, this all stemmed from some conversations that we were all having within these mixed spaces Zoom sessions, where we were talking about race and bringing in people from different backgrounds, different ideologies, religions, different ethnicities, and kind of having these difficult conversations. So this first topic is more about what is okay to say and what is not okay to say. And again, because these conversations are difficult, and what we have noticed is a lot of times people have them within their silos, but when you kind of bring people together, they typically will try to avoid talking about these topics. So I guess I'll kick off the first question and ask, when you do have kind of a mixed group, what is okay to say and what is not okay to say?
Well, I'll start off if it's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Because the way I kind of approach it is that I think it's okay to say everything, but in the form of a question, right? If you're unsure, we spend a lot of time in our heads thinking about what's right. And in fact, it freezes us, right? We don't actually say things or ask things because we're worried we're going to make a mistake. And so we don't have the conversations that we need to have. And so I think that if there's a question in your head about whether or not something should be said, I think it's okay to ask the question, is it okay? And I think I am talking about those things that are more nuanced. I think there's just some things like, I don't think it's ever okay to say the N-word, for me, right? And so when people say it, I will probably say something, but it also depends on the context that someone is saying it in, for me to decide how it's intended. But I think in general, if we're unsure, I think being willing and creating a space where you can ask a question, say, I'm not sure about this, but this is what's in my mind, and setting the context for whatever's coming out, because I think we need to start having some of those conversations we're avoiding now, because we're avoiding them because we don't know, and we'll never know if we don't actually start having them.
And I'm curious, and maybe this is for Sana, because I'm a child of immigrants. Do we have more hesitation to be a part of these conversations because we feel like, like already, I guess, maybe as minorities, that it's just not okay for us to be a part of that?
Are you talking about conversations around race?
Yes, race. And, and I think really, like, I'll give you a little bit of context. This particular topic came up because I was hesitant to say something, and it was actually about more like transgender, situations and that type of a thing. And that's where kind of this topic came up. So yes, race, but of course broader even than that, when we're not, part of a specific group, what's okay and what's not okay, and do we feel a little bit more hesitation as, again, like I said, a child of immigrants, is it a little bit more difficult?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had that conversation many times. As I mentioned, I'm part of a social justice themed book club, and that was one of the topics of conversation. And I was able to be my authentic self. I was able to share my values as a Muslim, and at the same time try to balance that with being very respectful of everyone else in the room who had really different ideas and values around LGBTQ issues. And I think it was actually a model for how we could have these conversations. I wish we had recorded it, because I tried to come with humility. Like, I don't know everything. I know what my religion teaches me. I know what I believe, which is that all human beings have dignity and matter and deserve respect, and kind of taking it from there. That's sort of the stepping stone that we all can agree on. And at the same time, I have these sort of values that are a little bit different from what others think. And we just had a really wonderful, respectful conversation around that. And I did approach it from a place of curiosity. So I did try to tackle some of those difficult questions or difficult conversations with questions.
Okay, I love that. And I guess, Chris, because we had a little bit of this conversation ourselves, again, like not all groups have to share the same values, right? Like we can all be different. And I think Sana also just kind of explained that, like, I'm sure people within that room might think some things a little bit differently. So what is that, do you believe, that kind of basis where this is, absolutely not okay, I'm not going to be able to share a conversation with you, or, with others, where you feel like, no, like we can still have these discussions and not feel like, there's still kind of a respect between us?
Well, and I think that's the key, right? Is respect. I mean, I think Dr. Nancy, you mentioned it. I mean, there are going to be certain words and certain characterizations where, one of us or someone will say, "Hey, listen, I'm not okay with that." And then there are other situations where they won't. I mean, we've had circumstances at work where, someone will get on a call and say, "Hi, guys," and maybe most people won't be offended and won't say anything, but then there have been others who have said, "Hey, I feel in that instance that you've degendered me." Now, I think that there are some who might just roll their eyes at that reaction and say, "Oh, we're woke, want to run amok," or all that kind of thing. But I think that what you'd like for people to respond with empathy, right? Because, hopefully the intent is not to offend and frustrate someone or make them feel as though you don't see them. Hopefully you're trying to communicate. And of course, it's certainly natural, and it can happen to anyone, that you might accidentally use a term that's outdated or you didn't realize was offensive to a certain person or group or what have you. So I think the first thing is trying to reach that point of empathy. And I think just kind of also piggyback on this topic and kind of getting into sort of when you talk about intergroup, I think that there is a lot of there's a big desire to close ranks within group, because like nobody agrees, right? Nobody in any group agrees with everyone else, right? There's a range of opinions in every single group, but I think that in a lot of instances, particularly when you're talking about ethnic or racial or religious minorities, there's a feeling that like when you get around mixed company, we kind of close ranks around certain things. We don't talk about what we think about these topics or those topics or whatever, and I think that sometimes can be challenging, and I think we've seen that even in some instances where people do come out and express certain opinions, and it's almost kind of, or talk about certain topics, and people say, "Whoa, you're not supposed to talk about that around other types of folks," So I think it can be interesting, and it can be hairy, and there are certainly, I'm not naive. There are certainly landmines, but I think it's important. I think it's important to talk about these things, and I think that the place you're coming from makes a big difference.
Yeah, and I think what brought also like Karen and I initially to have these mixed race conversations was actually an experience that we both encountered, where, again, like there was a situation where we didn't feel super, welcome, or actually I was kind of like, isolated in a conversation with Karen and another person. So just kind of, Karen, I guess based on your experience and what brought you to talk about some of these topics, why do you feel kind of like this sense, you mentioned that you feel strongly about this? What brought you to that?
Well, I guess, and maybe this isn't a direct answer to what you just asked, but something that comes to mind is intolerance of intolerance. So, okay, this person has some view that is intolerant, so therefore I'm now going to be intolerant of them. And I think that you actually, something you put in kind of our earlier discussions, Ayat, was around how people will often, if you don't wholesale agree with everything I agree with, I'm going to cancel everything you just said, or I'm going to not listen to anything you said because I don't agree with everything you said. And so I think that really prevents us from making progress. And I think that for me, not like I'm a white lady, I'm not a child of immigrants. So I think I feel like I have a certain privilege where, and a little bit of a platform that, like, if this goes sideways, my I don't know, reputation maybe can recover, or like there's less risk in it for me in a certain way. And so I do feel that responsibility to use that. But also at the same time, it does feel very scary, because what if I say the wrong thing and then there's some implication for, my business or my reputation or something like that. So, yeah, but I do feel like, I think the thing that I struggle with is, and I probably find myself doing, is the thing where I'm like, oh, that person, used something that sounds to me like a microaggression. So now I'm not going to listen to anything they have to say, or like, like kind of like the over sort of like in my head, maybe policing what people are saying. And I don't know. I just don't think that's super productive, but it's probably something that I'm doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, probably a lot of people suffer from that. And then it kind of takes us into like this cancel culture situation where people are canceled. But at the same time, I don't know, Dr. Nancy, if you agree, but like, I feel like it's impacted people of color more than anybody else on when it comes to that.
Yeah, I don't know that I can measure if it's more or less. I think it's negatively impacted a lot of people, and people who were trying to do the right thing, right? And I think that's the thing. I think there's a place for it, but I feel like it's been taken way out of proportion, and now you can't even make one mistake. And I would say, I'm going to date myself, Chris. I'm 55 years old. And I'm just grateful that there weren't, phones and recording devices when I was growing up, because I know I said things that were offensive, and I wasn't trying to do it intentionally, or, I did things, and we had the ability to make amends and to recover. And now we're in this place with cancel culture that you can't even make a mistake. You can't. And so everything has to be so scripted and planned out that there's really no authentic conversation, because people are really in fear of the repercussions that might come out if they say the wrong thing. And that goes back to what I said before. I don't know if there's a wrong thing. If I'm coming from a place of seeking to understand, of curiosity, that requires that we're willing to take risk and be vulnerable. If I'm not willing to take a risk and put myself out there, then why should you, or why should anybody else? And then how do we move forward? Nothing great, no great innovations, no great thinking took place in safety. And so we have to give each other grace to make mistakes, and then be held accountable, and to make amends. And I think if those things happen, then we should be striving to make mistakes, which means that we're actually doing something. So I get the whole notion of canceling because someone said the wrong thing or it offended someone, and then we cancel everything they said. Is we're losing. We're losing, and I'm not a big fan of the word allies, and we can talk about that later if we want, but I think you start as an ally, right? And then you become an accomplice. And then, but an ally is someone who feels like it's your problem, not their problem. And right now we need as many allies who at least feel like the issues that we're talking about are important enough to get behind it. And every time we cancel out one of those allies, we are canceling out potential support down the road and potential accomplices down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Sana, can you weigh in a little bit more about also cancel culture and the impacts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people call it accountability culture. They're trying to rephrase it. They don't like the term cancel culture. For me, there's a really large distinction between those who commit some egregious action and have shown no remorse. So in terms of impacting people of color, an example would be Bill Cosby or R. Kelly. Those are a couple of people who just showed no remorse and did something awful and should be boycotted to some extent, if you want to use the term boycott instead of cancel. That is appropriate. That is sending a message that what happened and what they did is not okay. But somebody like, let's take Will Smith, for example, who made a mistake publicly, and it was really awful, and then attempted to apologize. While his apology wasn't perfect, I do think that humility and that even attempt to put himself out there and apologize should allow for some sense of redemption. And it can be a conversation at that point. We can talk about was the apology sufficient? What does Chris Rock think? And kind of hash it out. But to be like, I will never watch any of his movies or I won't read his book, I don't think that's okay. And I actually did read his memoir or his autobiography after that incident, because I wanted to try to understand, like, how does he get to that point? And if you read his autobiography, you will very much understand why he did what he did. It was really well explained in his life circumstances. Not to justify it, it's absolutely not okay. But yeah, so just kind of at the end of the day, does that person show remorse, and do they want to engage in dialogue? If so, I think that it's really important to offer redemption and show grace. And if they don't have any remorse and they did something awful, yeah, there is a place for cancel culture for those people.
Yeah. Kim, and I'd just like to add, because what you also sparked for me, and I take this even to our justice system, right? And folks, we talk about, you serve your time in prison, but there really is no redemption for them, because they come out and they can't actually participate in society because of all the rules and punishments that even after they've done their time, that they're still doing this. And so, my question is always, is our goal to redeem? Is our goal to support people to, make better decisions and to understand where they went wrong and make amends and do that? And I think that, just the way we run our justice system and our prison system lets us know that I'm not sure that people are really that interested. It's like, you made a mistake and it's easier, and actually I think it's more about control. When we do that, it's about controlling people and controlling folks to not ever step out of that kind of norm or that comfort zone by having cancel culture be. And I think that it actually is in some ways harmful, not just to people of color, but harmful to all of us, because we're not actually able to have the conversations. But I'm not sure that that's not, I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not sure that's not part of what it's about.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question about that? So one of the greatest critics of cancel culture is someone like Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So there's this sense that people who are on the far right, they hate cancel culture. They think we're all just so fragile and we're taking away their freedom of speech. So how does that align with what you were just sharing right now? How do you make sense of those two things together?
Yeah, well, and I think I think they're different. I actually think that it's more in alignment with what you said, in that I think people who have no remorse about their behavior, who actually have intentionality behind it, right? So I can say something that's hurtful and it not be intentional, or if in that moment, like, you talked about Will Smith. I mean, he was intentional about the slap, but then he had remorse and he had time to think about it. It was a reaction rather than a response. I think when we're talking about those folks on the extreme right, and I don't want to label everyone who's conservative as that. I want to be clear about who we're talking about. I think that it's manipulation, and I don't think there is remorse. I think that it's intentional. Therefore, I'm again with you, this idea that there is a place for cancel culture, as I said before, but I don't think it's in the place where people then are paralyzed to even make mistakes or try something new or ask a question or say something. And if they understand the impact and are willing to make amends for it, take responsibility for it, and then try to make it right, I think that's where we have to give folks grace.
Yeah, but I think that that's like the most difficult part of this is that it's always the, more kind of powerful, loud voices that get heard. I think every single one of us on this call probably agrees with, like there's a place for it. And there's also that, hey, we should really have empathy and understand where people are coming from. And if they're showing some remorse, then yeah, like we need to kind of give people a chance. But how do we drown the other voices out, like that are unwilling to listen, and they're just really like, there to kind of make this sense so that we cannot say what we want to say, in giving us really that hesitation. That's where it's coming from. Like that hesitation is coming because of, some of these louder voices that make it very difficult to have these conversations. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I think that's really the tough part, right? Because I think and I'm not a conspiracy theorist either, but I can't help but notice that the folks, let's say, who follow Donald Trump and have been complaining the loudest about canceling and cancel culture are, right as we speak, canceling books, like banning books in numerous states, right? I mean, I never thought we'd see Judy Blume, banned, right? Alice, the Bluest Eye. I mean, Toni Morrison. Who'd ever thought that those books would be banned? So, I think that it almost feels as though, some of the folks on the far extreme right have decided to co-opt the term cancel culture that they say that they hate so much, and then use it to control thought, and control access to ideas in schools and in libraries. So much so to the point where I was reading an article last week, and there was a teacher who, in the school district where they were banning a bunch of books, and even going a step further than that, who just recently left teaching because they said, look, they want me to teach about the Civil War, but without mentioning slavery. Like, how am I supposed to do that? That's happening. In fact, there's a ballot measure in Texas right now. I don't know, who knows if it's going to pass or not, but there's a ballot measure where I think there's a proposal there that would teach slavery as what do they call it, involuntary relocation or something along those lines, some kind of really kind of sanitized euphemistic term, but I think that that's part of a larger effort to address grievance of voters that are on the far right, et cetera. So, coming back full circle, how do you drown out those voices? It's difficult because I think that they have now taken the mantle of what cancel culture started out as, where, Sana, I think you brilliantly pointed out, it was started out as an effort to drive more accountability for people who were doing egregious things. But now what it's turned into is, you don't agree with me, and I'm going to shut off your ability to be heard.
And I do think that, of course, having these conversations maybe is a little bit of an effort to try to bring forth the different ideas and, say, hey, we can have these conversations and we should be having these conversations. They're super important. But nonetheless, we're all coming from different backgrounds. And, again, I think like how we started this conversation was what's okay to say, what's not okay to say. I think we can all agree that we have kind of like a safe circle. But I do, again, want to see, Karen, your thoughts on, what you feel like. I heard once from somebody who's, like also white, and she mentioned that she didn't feel like, this is one of our Zoom calls, that she didn't feel like she could say anything because she felt like she, her voice is always, like she has privilege. So she just didn't feel like she could say anything in the conversation. So I wanted to kind of circle back to you on how you kind of approach that.
It's funny because as you were talking, I was like, crap, I was hoping she wouldn't call on me for this question, because I feel like I shouldn't be answering the, question on how cancel culture impacts people of color. So I guess that's funny that you should say that. I guess I do. Yeah, I know. I feel like I should just pass the mic, like it's not my place to talk about it, and more focus on what can I do to create a space for people to talk about it and have that. I guess that I would say the one thing that I do try to do is like, if I'm in a circle of other white people, maybe just try to like point out where race is impacting a certain situation, or I don't know. But I definitely feel, and I think that's also part of why I'm trying to actively, break out of that, because I don't think it's helpful, and it is a way of silencing and erasure. And but just like a couple weeks ago, I was at a walking history tour in my local area, and there was a Black woman on the tour, and somehow we all got to talking about plants, and she cracked a joke like that was like a kind of like she was like, oh, I'm so bad at, growing plants. I have a black thumb. And then she was like, ha ha ha, no pun intended or whatever. And like, it was a bunch of white people and we were all just like, didn't laugh. And I was like, why didn't I laugh? That was funny. And she meant it to be funny, but it's just like that automatic response of like, uh-oh, we're talking about a race thing. I need to shut my mouth. So I guess I don't really have a good answer for that.
Yeah, but I mean, I do believe, of course, like your voice is important. And again, like you've been just, obviously, like you said, you're open to these conversations, and we should all, again, I'm not Black, and I know that, there's so much racism in this country against Black people, a lot more than any, type of Muslim has been impacted by. Like, this is systematic racism that has affected Black people for, like since the creation of this country, right? So I understand that I'm also, like learning and growing in these conversations. So I certainly appreciate your perspective, Karen, so much. And again,
do you mind,
yeah,
do you mind if I just so one, I guess it's one kind of observation that I have around what you shared, Karen, because you're not alone in that. But I think it would behoove us and behoove white folks to actually start seeing themselves as racial beings having a racial experience. And I think that because, and it's funny because I've been thinking a lot even lately about our term people of color and then white people and having that, and I understand why it is there. And I'm not sure that we have found a better way to talk about it. And it further reinforces to white folks a separation from a racial experience, because white people are not only having a racial experience, but actually setting the standard for everyone else's racial experience, right? And so for us not to talk or see, for white folks not to talk and see themselves as racial beings, I think is also part of what the difficulty is in having these conversations.
That's interesting. Now, can you explain, I guess, for someone who may not be, as familiar with that concept, what do you mean when you say white people don't see themselves as racial beings?
The best analogy that I've heard is that it's like the water that fish swim in, that it surrounds you. Your racialized experience surrounds you, and it's normalized as the norm, and so you don't notice it. And we spend a lot of time not talking about it, right? And so people of color, on the other hand, spend a lot of time, whether people of color, not just racial, but just any group that's marginalized, spends a lot of time talking about their experiences being marginalized. So whether it's through religion or sexual orientation or whatever, but when we come to race, we talk about race because those are the lenses that social construct that has been laid out for us. But white people don't ever really have to, in general, talk about race as it impacts them. When they talk about race, it's always talking about, most of the time, I don't want to make an overgeneralization, but it's always talking about the other, right? About my experience as a Black person, or your experience as a Latina, or whatever your racial background is. But they don't see themselves as having a racial experience. And so, but it is the benchmark. Like everything that we do is based on a normalized, on a white racial experience. And so being able to say what is my racial identity as a white person? What does it mean? I think is a line of inquiry that's kind of worth, I think, investigating.
Yeah, there are movements to quote unquote decenter whiteness for that reason. And I think that is a good step in the right direction. I wanted to mention just a couple other things. Ayat, you talked about the experience of Black Americans and kind of contrasted that with Muslims. And I just wanted to remind everyone that 25% of Muslims in America are Black. So just a reminder of that intersectionality, that's really important. I also wanted to talk about the concept of making mistakes. So specifically white people feeling crippled, that they can't have a voice in these conversations. And while it's very important to elevate the voices that are most impacted, and I completely agree with that, I think it's equally important to speak up, ask questions, inquire, and model for everyone what it is to make a mistake and be corrected, and have humility and still move past that. I think that is way more powerful than just staying quiet. And that's what I try to model for my students in the classroom. We're all going to make mistakes. We should make mistakes. But the important thing is that we recognize our impact when that happens, regardless of intention, and that we repair whatever harm was done and we move past it. We all assume good intent, and we're able to move on past that. And then the other thing I want to mention is the idea of safe space. So in my classroom, you can say, hey, this is a safe space, but that sort of sends the message that we can say what we want and everyone can accept our ideas because it's safe here. I think a better concept is the idea of a brave space. So yeah, it is safe and we can share our ideas, and we also can gently correct one another when something doesn't land right or if it's offensive. So I like the term brave space a little bit more.
I like that too, actually, Sana. I remember, Chris, you mentioned that you went once with a bunch of your buddies, and you said you had a safe space and you guys were all talking about, like, different topics and whatnot. How does that relate to kind of like this idea between brave space and safe space?
Well, if it's like, say, for instance, like a bunch of the guys, and it's just the guys, I don't know how safe it is all the time. Guys, we love going after each other quite hard, especially when there's love and trust there. But in a way that's I think that makes it a brave space too. I mean, if you go to any black barbershop, you'll hear a range of opinions about sports, about religion, about politics, you name it. And you have everyone on different sides, and some people taking devil's advocate, just to kind of pull out ideas, and I think it's accepted that, someone's going to challenge your position, and it's not personal. They probably agree with you. You're sitting there saying, I mean, I grew up in Philly, as you guys all know. So, I could be sitting in the Philly barbershop and everybody's an Eagles fan. I can say, hey, listen, man, I think the Eagles going to win the Super Bowl this year, and there's somebody who definitely feels the same way is going to sit there and say, no, they're not, for these reasons. And they're going to take me on, and we're going to have a huge debate in the whole room about it, And so I think that that's great though, because, and one of the things is, I think toward my toddler son and socializing him is that it gives, those brave spaces give you the opportunity to test out ideas, to see how far you can push people with different personality types, both in questioning and also challenging ideas and things like that. And you're talking about people across all walks of life, right? You can have a corporate executive on one hand, you have a recently released parolee on the other hand, and everyone's there on equal footing having these conversations. So, I love the concept of a brave space. And I think that if the right conditions are there, it doesn't necessarily have to be quite so safe. And I think you can start digging down, a few more layers, because I think some topics you really do need to drill down and understand why people feel a certain way. And I think a lot of cases it can be for that person too. Like, why do you feel this way? Why are you threatened by this? Why does this bother you so much? And I think that, when people feel safe or when they feel brave, you can start to get to that level of understanding and probably not before. So I love that, Sana.
Yeah, we once had an encounter in one of our spaces where actually Sana and I were on the conversation, and somebody had mentioned to us, like, oh, like, where are your husbands? Kind of implying that, like, oh, like, Muslim women always need some sort of like an okay from their husband in order to be a part of something. So I appreciate, usually, Sana, I know that you've had lots of conversations like that and how you don't give up on those kinds of people. So I guess my question is twofold. When do you feel like you can kind of continue to like push and pursue? And when do you feel like, this person is just very, very, again, like, I don't want to say cancel, but like, yeah, like they're not going to change their mind. They don't have remorse.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been criticized by my friends in the past because I'll post something on Facebook and so-called friends of mine will respond very ignorantly. And some of my friends watching it in the sidelines are like, why are you still friends with that person? Like, how did you hear what they said to you? But I do truly believe in assuming good intent. I think that's the starting point. And I especially have grace with an older man of color. I'm just going to put it out there. Someone who lived through the civil rights movement, you have all the grace in the world. So I'm not going to cancel that person. They've been through a lot, and I want to hear from them, and what they bring to the conversation is far more valuable than any offense that I've taken. I will admit I am much more easily offended by a white man. Absolutely. And it's a lot easier for me to cancel a white man. At the same time, even when Donald Trump became elected or became president, the first thing I did was read Hillbilly Elegy. I'm like, you know what? I need to understand Trumpland. Like, who are these people? Who supported this man, and how do they feel? And it did give me empathy. I know it sounds awful. Sorry, did somebody want to say something?
No. I was just agreeing. I read the book prior to that, and I had a realization, a very similar one to you. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just
No, not at all. No, I think it's nice to have dialogue. Sometimes when I'm not seeing people's responses, when my face goes on the screen, I'm like, I'm not having a dialogue. I'm talking to myself.
Yeah.
Okay. But to my point. So, and then I remember I attended the People of Color conference shortly after he became president. And I went to my affinity group, the MENA group, Middle Eastern or North African. And everyone in the group, there were like 70 people there. They were like, he's trash. This is all crap. I'm so sick of this. They had no ounce of mercy or acceptance or like wanting to understand. And I felt like such an outlier in that group. And people were annoyed from me. They're like, they don't deserve a voice. Why do you care what they think? But I don't feel that way. I feel everyone thinks they're a good person, and they're a product of their upbringing, and they're trying to navigate this world as best they can. At the end of the day, for the most part, you still have the Hitlers of the world, but for the most part, that's how people feel about themselves. So I want to try to understand that. And I think the more we can engage in dialogue and I can listen, and actually like probably the greatest correlation to ending racism and bringing more love into the world is knowing people who aren't like you. Mm-hmm. I think that's the key. And so the more we can do that, that's the way that we're going to move forward.
Dr. Nancy, can you elaborate more on your, because I guess you read the same book and you had the same realization.
Yeah, it was. I read the book actually a few years ago when it first came out, and prior to the election, and I read it because it was recommended to me. But I remember reading it and thinking, like, it was the first time I said I kind of get, like, again, it's the people's experiences, and I'm like, so much of our legislation and so much of the national conversation has been around how to support, poor, marginalized people of color, specifically, Black, brown, Asian descent. And we really haven't had a conversation that I was aware of how to support poor white people living in who were also marginalized through poverty. And I realized that I was probably equally as guilty of really never having considered them as a population of people in need of support. And I remember thinking about, up until that point, thinking about poverty, but also mostly being focused on people of color in poverty, not really white people in poverty. And that story really just kind of shed a light that, when you've got an entire population that has really been ignored nationally and manipulated to an extent where now they're voting against their interest, right? So you can disenfranchise a group so much that they actually vote for someone, even if they don't have direct benefit, but they feel like this person is speaking to them. This person, for the first time, is sharing thoughts that they think. And when you feel like you've been ignored, which I believe that population has felt largely ignored, it becomes very clear why they supported Trump. Because even if even if they are voting against their own interests. Like, we understand that, the whole, Reagan era of, the welfare mama caricature was really created to, they couldn't take welfare away from poor white people, so they had to make it a Black person issue. And they had to make this idea of, who's using up your welfare, who's taking your money. And so people voted against their own interests that was supporting them. And that's kind of what we're seeing happen now, because we have ignored this group of people.
I have a slight rebuttal.
Yeah.
So I also read Hillbilly Elegy. And I had the same reaction that you guys did at the time. I mean, when Trump was elected in 2016, I went through all the gamut of motions, and even just intellectually trying to wrap my head around, how could this happen? How could this happen in America? And I set off on a similar journey to try to understand better. And so that book, I thought, like you both did, provided some insight and perspective. However, in the intervening years, and now that J.D. Vance is running for Senate, right? It's like I'm starting to wonder if he's not a bit of a fraud, right? Because he is giving voice to all of Donald Trump's worst instincts, and also I wonder, and honestly. I mean, he's a very hyper educated, elite educated person who is now channeling that same grievance. So to your point, Dr. Nancy, trying to get voters that came from similar backgrounds that he did and that he wrote about in his book to vote against their own self-interest due to racial resentment, right? So that's the first thing, where I kind of challenged myself about what I had thought 4 or 5 years ago. But then on top of that, I also can't help but notice, and I thought that there's a great book out by Heather McGee, The Sum of Us, where she talks about, she paints this great picture, of back in the 1930s and 40s, when all around the country, there were these, cities and around the country were building these beautiful resort style swimming clubs, swimming pools, right? And they were all over the country. Numerous, in some cities had multiple swimming pools. And then, of course, we got to a point where the sort of desegregation and integration happened. And then once it started, you started getting legislation that said, hey, look, people of color are also paying taxes for these publicly funded pools that they're not actually able to access. And that's not right. And so once you started seeing in different cities and different states that legislation happening and those pools having to become integrated, the response from the white population in those cities and towns was to shutter the pools. Like, no one can have okay, if we got to share them, no one can have them, right? And she painted a great picture, I think it might have been in Mississippi or somewhere in the South, where they basically drained the pool and covered it with dirt, and that was it. And then, of course, shortly after that, sometime after that, we saw the boom and the rise of private backyard pools and these private clubs, right? Which I never thought of. I grew up in a time where it was just accepted that that's what people do. If they can afford it, they'll have a pool in their backyard or something, or you just go to a swim club, or perhaps you'll have some really dilapidated public pool that you can go to, if you're brave. But I think that this whole notion that that there are parts of our population that see any sort of progress from other groups as a zero-sum game, right? And so if they're gaining, then we're losing, and therefore I'm willing to go without. I'm willing to go without universal health care. I'm going to, my certain standard of living and maybe my actual natural life may be decreased because I don't have access to care, but I don't want my tax dollars going toward other people who I deem unworthy having it. So it caused me to challenge, are these people really voting against their self-interest? We assume that they see their self-interest as having access to goods and services and everything. But for some, I think that the self-interest is being able to be a part of a group that has access to things that others don't.
Mhm.
And if it comes down to I need to share, then I'm no longer interested in it. Even if it comes down to democracy, right? I'm willing to throw this whole democracy experiment out the window if it means that I have to share power in a multiracial democracy.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid point. And I think both are true, right? Like I think that there is an understanding. I think there are folks who, from that demographic, who feel like they haven't had a voice, and I wonder what we could do, because when we're talking, it's not we're focused. I'm focused on Black issues because I'm Black. I mean, and I'm just being real. Like that's where I start, and then I branch out to the other intersectional parts. But really, really creating a space. And I'm going to go back to Sana, what you said too. One of the greatest lessons I learned was that to assume positive intent. And so my belief is that when you have an undereducated, undersupported, a group that's marginalized regardless of their race, that there's a tendency to want to have more, or see someone getting something you're not getting. And so the way our structure has really worked in separating us from each other, and not seeing that collectively, your survival, your thriving is actually then me thriving, and that we're all connected that way. And that message is getting lost. And so if there's anything, as I think about this conversation and what we're doing, and going back to even the notion of cancel culture, is how do we remain connected to each other, even when we don't 100% agree with each other, right? And how do we understand that fundamentally, I want you to be happy, and what your happiness looks like, the way you live, your choices you make, if they don't negatively impact me, then I need to let you be. And I just want us to come back to this idea of this kind of collective consciousness and collective well-being.
Yeah, I remember listening to the podcast, I think it was S-Town, and it also kind of zeroed in on like this individual who's very conflicted in what he feels and who he is, and being from really like, a white, poor kind of neighborhood in Alabama that's, there's like a lack of education. He was actually educated himself, but like, everybody else around him, there was a lack of education. So I think there's a tendency for those groups to, be more easily manipulated, as well as, we talked, right? I think, Chris, you mentioned how even within a lot of those school systems, the books that they're not exposed to, the type of education that they're getting, it is continuing this kind of like systematic way that's going to kind of impact the way that they think. So I guess I see, like that point that, hey, like a lot of people are exposed to, I don't know that they all feel this zero sum. Maybe there's some, in some senses, there are a percentage of them. They have such deep racism that they'd rather, everybody else suffer so that they could, just, and vote in that way. But I think that there's also like an issue with education and an issue with getting those resources to those people as well in order for them to kind of grow. But I guess the question is, then how do we reach? Like, how do we have those conversations? Is there something else that we can do? I mean, we're doing this podcast. That's great. What else can we do? Questions open to anybody who'd like to answer.
So a thought that's going through my head is we're talking about them, the, disenfranchised, impoverished white people, and what do they think? And I guess if we were talking about a different group, like let's say we were talking about transgendered folks, for example, I think I would be saying, oh, we shouldn't have this conversation without some representation. And so I guess part of me feels like we don't have maybe somebody that represents that group. And should we offer that same kind of like who's missing from the conversation that we would with, another group? So that's just something that crossed my mind as we're talking.
Yeah, and I think just to take that further too, Karen, I think that is, I mean, when we think about next steps, it's being willing to lean into, if this is an important topic for us, about conversations with folks from that demographic to have a deeper understanding. This weekend when I was off the grid, I met my friend's husband. He's 76, and we went to lunch with his high school friend. And from the beginning, it was an interesting kind of dynamic. I was trying to suss him out. He made different innuendos that led me to believe that he felt like I had a place. Asked me if I would be his chauffeur and different things like that. And but again, I'm trying to offer a different perspective and to have a conversation with him. And he ended it by saying, we were talking about something. He's like, well, the Northern War of Aggression. And I just looked at him and I said, is that what you call it? And he's like, no, that's what he says, that's what it's called. I said, I know what it's called in the South. I said, but my question is that what you call it? And he said, well, I did live there for 20 years. I'm like, okay. And so, kind of bringing this back to that thing, it's like, I'm willing to assume positive intentions and give people the benefit of the doubt. And then there's a point to where, that what they're trying to do is harm you. Right. And then those moments, those are the moments that I get to choose to step away, and I get to choose not to engage. And so, I'm always open to talking with folks from, different backgrounds with different experiences, but there's got to be this agreement of how we're engaging with each other. And if it can't be respectful, if it can't be with empathy and at least trying to understand each other, then that's not the right one. But I don't think it should stop us from inviting that other voice, that missing perspective to the table.
But do we only have those conversations when there's a representative of each, like a sexual orientation or a race, or can we have those conversations without that representation? What do you think, Sana? Oh, go ahead.
No, please. Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I think it's both. I don't think it's either or, but.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we would have representation from a variety of people. Of course, it's a little bit hard to find that. I will say, as you were speaking, Dr. Nancy, I have the privilege of being a teacher. And so I meet a lot of students, hundreds of students that I've taught in my life. And oftentimes they have different personalities, different backgrounds, and sometimes they don't initially take well to me. And every time I have had a negative encounter with a student, or a student has been openly hostile towards me, which has happened multiple times, and I took the time to sit with that student and spend time with them and try to understand what's going on in their heads, every single time without fail, it always came down to them having deep pain inside of them. Mm-hmm. It had nothing to do with me. Mm-hmm. One time it was anti-immigration, don't bring those Syrian terrorists into the country. Turns out he has a very strained relationship with his parents. He was adopted and he doesn't know his place in the world. Mm-hmm. Another student who just was just adamant about attacking me in the classroom and disrespecting me openly. She was struggling with her sexual identity. Another student, this was by far the most difficult one I've ever had, spent the entire year sabotaging my lessons and having extreme behavior issues. Last day of school, writes to me in his journal, I have crippling depression and I want to die. Mm-hmm. So I'm just like, gosh. And these only students, I think sometimes that relationship, only a student would eventually open up in that way and share that with the teacher if they believe that the teacher just cared for them and tried to build that trust all year long. It's very rare for adults to have those conversations. And so I kind of have that angle about the world and the way people hurt inside and how they project that on the outside in a way that's a little bit unique, I think. And that's what helps bring that compassion for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I totally agree. I mean, I just, for me, I do this work this is the work I do. My background is education too. And I was a classroom teacher in juvenile court and community schools for 10 years. And and they were the most challenging and also at the same time the most rewarding, group of kids I ever had the pleasure of teaching. And but I also and I also recognize that I have to be careful of how I spend my energy, right? And when I'm thinking of a 16, 17, 18-year-old, I got all day. I've got more energy. When I'm thinking of an 80-year-old, I'm going to try, but there's a point where I may not, because I don't know that I have the energy that it takes to do that. And so it's also for me about self-care, and there's still compassion. There's still, respect. And I was not disrespectful to him. I just would never be that. That's just not who I am. And I also recognize that I don't have the energy for this particular conversation at this point. After what I felt was like 2 hours of constantly trying to redirect and offer a different perspective. And then there's a point where there's just enough. And I think, I can do that without canceling, though. I can do that without saying, like if he shows up in my town because he's here and I see him again, I would say hello. I would be respectful, but I don't have to engage. And I think that's a part of us also understanding how to take care of ourselves in these situations.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think ultimately it is about understanding and having empathy, and you cannot have that empathy without having these conversations and talking to people that are different than yourself. Actually, recently I met this one lady who said that she was just taking a walk in the park, and there was a man that was fishing, and he's like, "Go back to your country," or something like that. And so she insists. She's like, "I don't usually go back, but I wanted to go back and engage." So she went back and she engaged and she talked to him, and "I'm so sorry, you feel this way." And she kind of had a conversation. Turns out that he had lost his son in, I think, Iraq. And, it was actually the anniversary of his death. And he told her, he's like, "I really don't feel that way about you guys, but I'm just dealing with a lot right now." So again, she made the effort. And I think sometimes you can, and sometimes you have the space to, sometimes you don't, simply, or you've tried, and some people are just unwilling to shift or change, and it's not worth having that conversation or spending that energy.
Yeah.
But I think we can wrap it up. I think this was an excellent first episode, great conversations. I just want to get final thoughts from each person. So maybe we can start off with Dr. Nancy, if you'd like.
Well, I guess my final thoughts would just be that I've really just appreciated the conversation. What I loved about Mixed Spaces, and what I've enjoyed about today is the willingness to have a discussion and share contrary, thoughts about things. And I think that this is modeling what it's like to have have conversations where we're not going to all walk away agreeing. It's not, we're not necessarily speaking to the choir in every single thing, but there is a level of respect and seeking to understand each other that I really value, and why I wanted to be a part of this. So thank you.
Right. Sana?
Well, first of all, kudos to you, Ayat, for moderating. You did such a terrific job. I'm super proud of you.
Thank you.
We didn't talk all over each other. We did better than The View. I think The View needs to watch out.
Well, you guys are amazing as well. So
yeah, I really appreciate it, as Dr. Nancy mentioned, the way that we were able to share contrary viewpoints or even correct something, and but I'll just be very receptive to that and make space for everyone to speak. I didn't hear that much from Karen. I would like to hear more from you in the future, and I think you absolutely have a space despite your name being Karen. And yeah, I just appreciate all of you.
Well, I guess on that note, I'll share kind of some of my takeaways or things that I'm, what I grabbed from the conversation. And so, from Dr. Nancy, it was helpful to hear you say the thing about white people being aware of their own racial experience. It's sort of, I do feel like I've been sort of waking up from the matrix a little bit, whoa, there's this whole, thing that I didn't know was there that's there. And that's something that I think I'm going to just bring forth into the next little period and observe. And Sana, your brave spaces, and then that really resonates, as well as the accountability culture of hey, if you say something and it turns out to not be the right thing, just focus on your response and how you model that you can say the wrong thing and recover from it. And so those are a couple things. And then I think what I'm still struggling with or thinking about is really just a lot of the topic that you brought up is, what is okay to say? And like, even the thing I said at the end, like, oh, maybe we shouldn't talk about this because we don't have representation of the people. And then it's like, well, is that just another way of canceling and shutting things down? Is that like, is that let's have great representation, or is that just another way of shutting conversations down? And can you talk about, I don't know. So I think I'm still wrestling with the topic overall, but that's good. It got me thinking. So I'm just so honored to be among you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, no, I think this was great. It was a great conversation. I think that, kudos. Also, I want to reiterate, you did a fantastic job as moderator. So you set the bar really high as we're going to rotate in the future. But, I think it's, I think this is what, we talked about what can be done, what can we do in the face of the efforts to sort of ban books and really shut down conversations and shut down access to historical references to why things are the way that they are in our society. It's interesting to me that people just in our country, in our society, just don't question things, right? Like, oh, people of color and people of certain ethnicities or whatever live in certain neighborhoods, and white people live in mostly white neighborhoods and go to mostly white schools, and they go to other schools and everything, and no one questions that, right? Like, why is that the case? And so I think the more that we start talking about it, and the more we can bring in historical perspectives, I think there are a lot of people who truly, would like to understand the answers to some of these questions, to put some context around what's going on in our society. And I think that these kind of conversations are even more important because certain reference material is not going to be available, at least publicly, in books and schools and things like that. So I think that we, as citizens and individuals in our societies and our own neighborhoods and communities, have to spark some of these conversations. And it's always going to be, I think there are always going to be landmines, like I said earlier. There are always going to be opportunities to say the wrong thing. The thing that's the right thing today may be the wrong thing tomorrow, right? So you could totally be, on the right page, and then you didn't get the memo that, oh, we're not saying that anymore, as of yesterday. So I think you just have to keep forging ahead. And I think that intent does matter. But I think also empathy when you do say something wrong, and we're just going to keep this thing trucking. And, Karen, I think to your point, if there are folks who, want to come on and join a conversation and represent different perspectives and viewpoints, we're more than happy to have them. So, but we're not going to stop talking. That's for certain. But I'll bring it back to you to kind of.
No, thank you all for all of the points were so amazing. You guys did such a great job. Honestly, I had an amazing panel to work with. So again, appreciate everybody's perspective. I know that we're going to have more conversations, and I know we're going to have you guys back on because you guys are amazing. So thank you again. And thank you to all those who listened as well.
Fantastic.
All right.